The Lost Teachings of Jesus, a journey through time and truth. The air was thick with the scent of ancient incense, swirling around the humble figure seated at the edge of the forgotten ruins. A quiet wind whispered through the dilapidated columns of an ancient temple, now long abandoned. This was not just a place of worship, it was a crossroads between time and eternity. A site that had seen empires rise and fall, where the past collided with the present, and where the echoes of lost truths still lingered. Elias had been searching for answers for as long as he could remember. A scholar of religious history, he had devoted his life to uncovering the mysteries hidden in the sacred texts. Yet, despite years of study, he felt as if something had been missing, something profound, something that had been buried beneath centuries of translation errors, historical conflicts, and deliberate suppression. One name kept appearing in his research: Jesus of Nazareth. Not the figure portrayed in the Bible that most people knew, but the one hidden behind layers of myth, distortion, and lost teachings. Elias believed that within the depths of ancient scrolls, hidden away by those who sought to control the message, lay a truth far greater than any religious institution had ever allowed to surface. He had discovered references to these lost teachings in obscure manuscripts, writings so old that they barely survived the ravages of time. These teachings spoke not of power, judgment, or divine wrath, but of love, forgiveness, and a deep, spiritual connection between humanity and the divine. Teachings that challenged the very fabric of what was considered sacred and redefined the nature of salvation. As Elias knelt in the ruins, a strange feeling overcame him. It was as if the very stones beneath him whispered their secrets, urging him forward into a discovery that would alter everything he knew. The path ahead was uncertain, and the truths he sought were buried in the sands of history. But one thing was clear: the journey to uncover the lost teachings of Jesus had begun. Elias sat quietly for hours, his fingers tracing the delicate, time-worn edges of the scroll he had uncovered deep within the ruins. The ancient parchment, fragile and nearly disintegrating under his touch, had been hidden for centuries. It was a fragment from a long-lost manuscript, one that scholars had believed to be nothing more than a myth. Yet here it was, tangible, real, and revealing a message that could change the course of history. As he unrolled the scroll with the utmost care, Elias felt a sense of reverence wash over him. This was no ordinary discovery, this was the key to something far greater. The text began with a simple, but profound question: what is the true path to salvation? The words seemed to echo through the silence of the ancient temple. A question that had been asked by millions of souls over the millennia. But what Elias was about to read was far different from the conventional teachings that had been passed down through the ages. The manuscript described a series of teachings that were not present in the canonical Gospels, the teachings of Jesus that had been left out for reasons unknown. These were not the stories of miracles or divine proclamations, but teachings about love, compassion, and the nature of human suffering. They were subtle, often hidden in parables, urging followers to look beyond the surface of their lives and confront their own inner darkness. The first of these teachings was startling in its simplicity: the kingdom of heaven is not a place, but a state of being. Elias read it again, as though trying to find some deeper meaning hidden between the words. The idea that heaven was not a distant realm to be attained after death, but a state of being to be achieved in the present moment, struck him with its profound implications. It was a direct challenge to centuries of theological interpretation, a call to experience divine connection here and now, not in some distant future. Elias knew that this was not just a teaching about the afterlife, but about how one should live their life in the present. The kingdom of heaven, as described in this text, was a state of peace, harmony, and love that transcended earthly struggles. To experience it, one had to cultivate a deep awareness of their thoughts, actions, and interactions with others. It was a call to live with intention, to embrace the divine within oneself and others. As Elias continued reading, he found another striking passage: "Forgive those who harm you, for they know not what they do. And in your forgiveness, you will be healed." The words seemed to pulse with energy, as though they were alive. They echoed something he had always believed but never fully understood: the idea that forgiveness was not just a moral act, but a path to personal liberation. Elias had spent much of his life studying religious texts, but this teaching was different. It was not about the forgiveness of sins, as preached by the traditional churches, but about the personal power of forgiveness as a means of healing one's soul. It suggested that those who hurt us, whether intentionally or not, were also trapped in their own pain and ignorance. By forgiving them, we liberated ourselves from the cycle of suffering that bound us to them. He paused, deep in thought. This was the type of truth that could change lives. If only people could understand it. To forgive, truly forgive, was not just to absolve others, it was to free oneself from the chains of resentment and anger that so often dictated one's emotional and mental state. It was an act of self-liberation, not an act of charity. But Elias knew that this was not an easy path. Forgiveness required profound strength, a strength that was often in short supply in a world so deeply entrenched in division and conflict. It required an understanding of the interconnectedness of all people, an awareness that no one was beyond redemption. And this, Elias realized, was what Jesus had been teaching all along. The scroll continued, each passage more astonishing than the last. One particularly cryptic teaching stood out: those who seek power will never find it. For true power lies in surrender. Elias furrowed his brow at this statement, trying to decipher its meaning. Power through surrender? It seemed counterintuitive, even paradoxical. The text explained that true power was not about control or domination, but about the ability to release one's ego and desires in order to align with a greater divine will. To surrender was to accept the flow of life, to trust in the universe, and to understand that one's own desires were often at odds with the higher purpose of existence. This teaching was about letting go of the need for control, about trusting in the divine order of the universe and surrendering to its wisdom. Elias felt a deep resonance with this idea. In his own life, he had spent years striving for success, pushing himself to achieve goals that seemed important at the time. Yet, despite all his efforts, he often found himself feeling unfulfilled, as though something was always missing. Now, he understood why. His desire for control, for achievement, had blinded him to the deeper truths of existence. True power, it seemed, was not about accomplishing more, but about accepting what was and living in harmony with the present moment. As Elias moved through the scroll, he came upon a teaching that seemed to speak directly to the struggles of the modern world. Those who hold on to fear will never know peace. Fear is the enemy of love, and love is the key to freedom. Elias had always known that fear was a powerful force, but he had never fully realized how much it shaped his life. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the unknown, these were the forces that often governed his decisions, his relationships, and his outlook on the world. And yet, here was Jesus, telling him that fear was the ultimate barrier to love and freedom. This teaching was a direct challenge to everything Elias had believed about strength and resilience. It suggested that true strength came not from overcoming fear, but from embracing love. Fear and love were opposites, and in order to truly live a life of freedom, one had to let go of fear and trust in the power of love to guide him through the challenges of life. The more Elias read, the more he realized that these teachings were not just religious doctrines, they were a way of life. They were practical, actionable insights into how one could live with greater peace, love, and fulfillment. They were a blueprint for a life well lived, a life that was connected to the divine in every moment, not just in moments of prayer or worship. As he sat there in the ruins, the weight of the teachings began to settle in. Elias knew that these words had been lost for a reason. The message they contained was too powerful, too transformative, for the world as it was. But now, in this moment, he had uncovered them, and with that discovery came a responsibility to share these teachings with the world. But Elias also understood the risks. The teachings he had uncovered were not popular, and they would not be easily accepted. They would challenge the very foundation of established religious and social systems. He could already imagine the backlash, the resistance, and the attempts to suppress the truth once again. But Elias was determined. He had uncovered something too important to be ignored, and he would stop at nothing to share it with the world, even if it meant facing danger and opposition. With renewed determination, Elias carefully rolled up the scroll and tucked it into his bag. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he was no longer afraid. He had found the truth, and now it was his duty to share it, no matter the cost. Elias had no way of knowing how far his journey would take him, or how the teachings he had uncovered would reshape the world. but the weight of the knowledge he carried felt overwhelming. The ancient words seemed to pulse with life, as though they were meant to be lived, not just understood. And as he continued to traverse deeper into the heart of the lost teachings, Elias realized that this discovery was more than just an academic pursuit. It was a call to action, an invitation to transform his life and the world around him. As he traveled from town to town, speaking quietly with those who would listen, Elias began to encounter resistance. Some welcomed the message, seeing it as a new, refreshing perspective on the teachings of Jesus, while others, those entrenched in the traditional beliefs, viewed his findings as heresy. To them, the idea that the kingdom of heaven was not a distant paradise, but a state of being that could be achieved in the present moment, was a dangerous and subversive thought. But Elias was undeterred. He knew that this was not just a personal journey, it was a global one. The world needed to hear this message. People were living in fear, in pain, and in suffering, but these teachings offered a different path, one that transcended the limitations of religion, society, and culture. They spoke to the human soul in a way that transcended time and space. It was a message of liberation, not just from sin, but from the very conditions of human existence. One evening, after traveling through dense forests and across barren hills, Elias found himself in a small village at the foot of a mountain. The villagers were humble, poor, and worn by the struggles of life. They worked tirelessly, day in and day out, yet they never seemed to be able to escape their hardships. Elias had heard whispers about this village. The people here were said to be deeply spiritual, yet they lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety, caught in a cycle of poverty and despair. As Elias sat with them around a small fire, he shared the teachings he had uncovered. He spoke of forgiveness, not as a moral obligation, but as a path to freedom. He explained that forgiveness was not just for the wrongdoers, it was for those who held on to anger, resentment, and fear. It was about releasing the chains of negativity that bound people to their pain. He spoke of the kingdom of heaven not as a future event, but as a present reality, one that could be experienced through acts of love, compassion, and mindful living. At first, the villagers were skeptical. They had heard similar ideas before, from preachers and scholars who passed through, promising salvation and change. But something about Elias's words felt different. There was an authenticity in his voice, a quiet conviction that seemed to resonate with their hearts. The idea that they could transform their lives, that they could create heaven on earth, was both liberating and terrifying. Could it really be that simple? One of the older women in the group, a wise matriarch named Miriam, leaned forward. Her face was wrinkled with age, but her eyes were sharp, filled with a quiet wisdom. "You speak of forgiveness," she said softly, "but how can we forgive when we have been wronged so many times? How can we let go of the fear that has been ingrained in us for generations?" Elias looked into her eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He understood her fear, for it was the same fear that had plagued him for much of his life. Fear of loss, fear of betrayal, fear of the unknown. It was the same fear that had kept him from fully embracing the teachings he had discovered. But now, he knew that the answer was clear. "You forgive not for them," Elias replied, his voice steady and filled with compassion. "But for you, you forgive because holding on to that pain only keeps you chained to the past. When you forgive, you are setting yourself free. You are choosing love over fear, peace over conflict." There was a long silence as the villagers absorbed his words. Some nodded, others looked down, still uncertain, but Elias could see the shift in their hearts, a glimmer of hope beginning to take root. They had lived in fear for so long, but now they were beginning to understand that forgiveness was not just a release for the wrongdoer, it was a release for themselves. The following days were filled with conversations, meditations, and moments of quiet reflection. Elias shared the teachings with the villagers, showing them how they could create a life of abundance, not through material wealth, but through spiritual richness. He spoke of the importance of surrendering to the divine flow of life, of trusting that the universe had a greater plan than they could see. And as he spoke, he saw the people begin to change. They started to forgive the past, to let go of their fears, and to embrace the present moment. It was not easy, but they began to understand that the path to peace was not one of accumulation, but of release. On the final night of his stay, Elias gathered the villagers together one last time. They sat in a circle under the stars, the warmth of the fire casting long shadows across their faces. "I will leave tomorrow," he said quietly, "but remember this, the kingdom of heaven is already here. Within you, it is not a distant dream, it is a reality that you can choose to live each day. And the path to that kingdom is not one of struggle or pain, but of love, forgiveness, and surrender." The villagers looked at one another, their faces alight with a newfound sense of peace. They understood now that their lives did not have to be defined by fear, by poverty, or by the chains of their past. They could choose to live differently. They could choose to live with love, to see the divine in each other, and to embrace the present moment as the true kingdom of heaven. Elias stood up and walked away from the circle, feeling a sense of peace in his heart. His journey was far from over, and he knew that there was much more work to be done. But for the first time in his life, he felt the truth of the teachings he had uncovered deep within him. He had come to the ruins searching for answers, but now he understood that the answers were not just in the scrolls or the ancient manuscripts, they were within each person, within each soul that was willing to listen. As he climbed the mountain the next morning, Elias looked out over the village below, the sun rising slowly on the horizon. He realized that this journey was not just about uncovering lost truths, it was about sharing those truths with others, helping them to find their own path to liberation. The road ahead was uncertain, but Elias felt more certain than ever that he was on the right path. The teachings of Jesus were not lost, not truly, they had simply been forgotten, hidden away by time, by fear, and by the human desire for control. But now, they were being reborn, and with them, a new possibility for humanity, one rooted in love, forgiveness, and the realization that the kingdom of heaven was not some distant dream, but a reality that could be lived every day. The days after Elias's departure from the village passed quietly, but the ripples of his presence remained. The teachings he had shared began to transform the lives of the villagers in ways that were both subtle and profound. It was as if, for the first time, they had truly awakened to the possibility that they could live in peace, not because of external circumstances, but because of the inner peace they chose to cultivate. Months passed, and the village grew more vibrant. People worked together, not just for survival, but with a sense of shared purpose. They no longer saw their hardships as burdens, but as opportunities to practice love and compassion. The wounds of the past, long carried through generations, began to heal, and fear no longer held sway over their daily lives. The kingdom of heaven was no longer a distant dream, it was a living reality that they created every single day, in their thoughts, their actions, and their relationships. For Elias, the journey was far from over. He had discovered something so powerful, so life-changing, but he knew that the world needed to hear it too. The teachings he had uncovered were not meant to stay hidden forever. They were meant to be shared, to awaken others to the truth that lay dormant within them. He traveled further, sharing the teachings with those who would listen. Some greeted him with open arms, eager to embrace the message of love, forgiveness, and surrender. Others, however, rejected it. The world, it seemed, was not yet ready for such a radical shift. People were entrenched in their beliefs, and the systems of control that had been built over centuries were not easily dismantled. But Elias did not waver. He had seen the transformation in the village, and that was enough. He knew that the seeds had been planted, and in time, they would grow. One evening, while traveling through a bustling city, Elias met a man named Thomas. Thomas was a scholar, much like Elias had once been, but he was consumed by doubt. He had studied theology for years, but the more he learned, the more questions arose. He had never felt the deep, abiding peace that the teachings of Jesus promised. Instead, he felt lost, disconnected from any real sense of spiritual truth. When Elias spoke to him about the lost teachings, Thomas was intrigued but skeptical. "You say that the kingdom of heaven is here, within us," Thomas said, "but I've never felt it. I've prayed, I've meditated, I've followed the rituals, but something is always missing. How do I know that what you're saying is true?" Elias smiled gently, recognizing the same doubt in Thomas that he had once carried within himself. "Thomas," he said softly, "the kingdom of heaven is not something you seek from the outside. It is something you awaken within yourself. The peace you seek is already within you. It has always been there. You have simply been looking for it in the wrong places." Thomas looked at Elias, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. But how do I awaken it? How do I find it within myself? Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. Begin by letting go of the need for control. Surrender to the present moment. And in that surrender, you will find peace. Forgive yourself, forgive others, and open your heart to love. It is not a process of achieving, but of being. The kingdom of heaven is not something you find, it is something you become. The words struck a deep chord within Thomas. He had spent so many years striving for spiritual knowledge, for understanding, that he had never thought to simply be. In that moment, he realized that the true path to peace was not one of effort, but one of surrender. Over the following weeks, Thomas joined Elias on his travels, slowly embracing the teachings that Elias had shared. It was not an easy journey. There were moments of doubt, moments of fear, but Thomas began to understand what Elias had meant. He learned that the answers were not found in books, in rituals, or in external achievements. They were found in the quiet moments of stillness, in the surrender of the ego, and in the acceptance of love as the highest truth. Meanwhile, back in the village, the impact of Elias's teachings continued to unfold. The villagers had become living examples of the truth they had discovered. They no longer feared the future, for they had learned that peace was not dependent on what was to come, but on what they chose to cultivate in the present moment. They had created a community where love, compassion, and forgiveness were the foundation of every interaction. And as the seasons changed, the village flourished in ways that were not just material, but spiritual. The teachings of Jesus, as rediscovered by Elias, were slowly spreading across the land, finding their way into the hearts of those who were ready to hear them. It was not an easy task. There were many obstacles, many forces of resistance, but Elias knew that his mission was not to convince everyone. His mission was to awaken those who were ready, to plant the seed of truth in their hearts, and to trust that the rest would unfold in its own time. One evening, as Elias and Thomas sat by a fire, reflecting on their journey, Elias spoke of his growing sense of purpose. "The world is awakening," he said softly, "but it will take time. The seeds we plant today may not bear fruit for many years. But we must trust that the truth will eventually rise, just as the sun rises each morning, regardless of the clouds that may obscure it." Thomas nodded, a peaceful smile on his face. "And the kingdom of heaven," he said, "is not something we wait for. It is something we live." "Yes," Elias agreed, his heart full. "The kingdom of heaven is not a place we go to. It is a place we create. Every day, in every moment." As the fire crackled softly between them, Elias realized that his journey had come full circle. He had begun his quest searching for lost teachings, for truths that had been buried by time and forgotten by the world. But now, he understood that the real discovery was not in the ancient scrolls or forgotten scriptures. The true discovery was within himself, and within all of humanity, the realization that the kingdom of heaven was already here, waiting to be awakened by those who were willing to embrace love, forgiveness, and surrender. And as he looked up at the stars, Elias knew that the journey was far from over. The truth was eternal, and it would continue to spread, one heart at a time, until the whole world awoke to the reality that the kingdom of heaven was not a distant dream, but a living, breathing reality that could be found in every act of love, in every moment of forgiveness, and in every act of surrender. The lost teachings had been found, and now, it was time for the world to remember.